If I ask you to explain your work in 3 minutes to a person who has almost zero knowledge on what you do, how would you explain it to them? Hello everyone, my name is Renee and I'm a PhD student studying in Australia. I will complete 3 years of my degree next month and be in my 4th and final year. Recently, I competed in the 3-minute thesis or the 3MT competition. For those who are not familiar with the 3MT, it's basically a competition where PhD students explain their research to a non-specialist audience within 3 minutes. You can only have a single static slide that complements your speech, so your oral presentation is the main factor of your entire presentation. I won runner-up prize, and along with the winner from our school, will go on to compete in the next round, which is the faculty round. Today, I want to share with you some tips on how to prepare for a successful and impactful presentation. This video will be tailored to a more 3MT style presentation, but these tips are still super helpful in preparing for a great presentation for all kinds of subjects or topics. I'm going to include examples as well as things that I did for my own presentation. So, by the end of this video, you'll have all the tools and strategies to ace your next presentation. This video will be split into 4 sections, and the timestamps will be right here. The first tip is to know who your audience is. Are they in the same field as you, or are they in a general population? This is really important to keep in mind because this determines what information you leave out or information you keep in, which is essentially the language and style you're going to be presenting in. For example, if you're presenting in a cancer seminar on your breast cancer research, you probably won't go into detail on all the background knowledge of cancer cells and explaining all that terminology. You'll probably also speak in a very scientific and very technical manner. For the 3MT, the presentation is targeted to a general audience, so we assume that they have basic science, basic biology, and that's all. The way I will explain my research will be completely different to how I would at a seminar. So in this case, it is a good idea to avoid jargon or any technical terms. Instead, use analogies or metaphors to make your content more digestible, easier to understand, and retain information much better. I remember when I was at a workshop for the 3MT, one of the judges for last year's competition says she couldn't remember the specific details of the winner talk last year, but a year later, she still clearly remembers her analogy. So this is how impactful a good analogy can be. A classic example is saying that DNA is like the cooking instructions for the cell because it needs to follow the instructions and the correct steps to make protein. Another popular example is that if you're familiar with CRISPR, a lot of people say that they're like the molecular scissors that can edit DNA. Of course, thinking of your own unique analogy is the best. Using the breast cancer example, an analogy that comes to my mind is it's like having a restaurant. The DNA is the cooking instructions or the recipe, the cells are the chefs that are meant to follow the instructions, and the cancer cells are the bad chefs. The second tip is to define your purpose. I want you to pause this video and think about what the goal is you're trying to achieve through your talk. Is it to sell a product? Is it to influence your audience? Or is it to spread a message? Your purpose will help define your take-home message and help narrow down what you need to say. For a 3-minute thesis presentation, the main purpose is to tell your audience why your research is important, the impact your research has on bettering the world, and why they should care. This brings us to the third tip. Once you have your purpose, you can then decide how you're going to structure it. And just like writing an essay or a book, a presentation usually has an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. So basically, you should be telling your audience a story. And a good story can convey messages much better than just pure facts. For this, you should think about your main points, which can be split into 3 smaller points. The first one is, what is the problem? The second one is, why is it a problem and how are you going to solve this problem? Or how are you going to close the gap a little bit more? The last one is, what are the steps you've already taken to try to achieve it? To keep people engaged and interested, you can start with a shocking or surprising fact to grab their attention. Using the breast cancer example again, I'm going to give you 2 examples and ask you which statement is more impactful. The first one, breast cancer affects many people around the world. The second one in 7 women around the world have the risk of being diagnosed with breast cancer over a lifetime. Do you see how much more impact there is by adding a statistic into your statement? This number, 1 in 7, will probably make the listener quite surprised. The women being diagnosed with breast cancer is more common than one would think, and that brings their attention. Another way you can create impact is engaging with the audience. An example could be asking a question. For example, how many people here know of someone that was diagnosed with breast cancer? The second point, it could be that current treatment for breast cancer isn't as effective and new ways of treatments are needed, and you have developed a better way to do it. For a non-specialist or lay audience, this part should be very simplified. For this, I highly encourage you to show your draft to friends, families, partners that aren't very familiar with your topic, because they can provide feedback on what makes sense and what doesn't. When I first read my draft to my supervisor and the colleagues from my lab, everything made sense and everything seemed really simplified. But when I shared the exact same draft to others that aren't familiar with my research, they immediately pointed out parts that were too complicated or just didn't quite make sense. So I had to actually simplify my draft another 3 to 4 times to make it more digestible. The other thing is that if you're using a metaphor or an analogy, make sure to keep it in the body of your speech. In the beginning, we said that DNA was like a cookbook, so let's stick to that for the rest of our talk. Continue with that analogy and explain how cancer cells aren't following the recipe and cooking, burnt food or food that's just not edible. Because the bad chefs, which are our cancer cells, aren't behaving and making the right orders. So the entire restaurant, which is the body's system, is an entire mess. But you found a way, which is your developed drug or treatment, to try to fire the bad chefs. For the final point, we previously mentioned that we found a way to get rid of the bad chefs. So let's go into a little bit more detail, but obviously in a simplified manner to elaborate on that. For example, you hired a manager, which is your treatment, to fire the bad chefs and keep the restaurant under control. And with your new management, you killed 50% more cancer cells and showed the drug worked. With this, it's time to wrap up with the conclusions. The most common way to conclude or end your talk is by circling back to the idea or the problem you mentioned at the start. For a 3-minute thesis style presentation, since there usually is an analogy or metaphor used in the beginning, the entire story becomes whole once you tie that analogy back in again. So in the beginning, we said how cancer cells are like the bad chefs that don't want to follow the recipe correctly, causing problems in the kitchen and affecting the operation of the entire restaurant. But with your special drug or your special treatment, which is our new manager, you can fire the bad chefs and restore order. Now that we have our presentation in place, let's talk about tips to present with confidence. The first tip is to not read or recite. You should know your content inside and out. And this doesn't matter if your presentation is for 3 minutes or for 30 minutes. Knowing your material well in itself will give you confidence. One thing that really helped me with knowing my content well was, of course, having the key message and structure of the presentation in place, which is what we talked about in the first few sections of the video. But with mastering your content, you also understand that you don't need your presentation to be exactly word for word like you've written in your script. You are free to swap out for synonyms or rephrase a sentence if you need, because your key message is still the same and you know what it is. The second tip I have is to practice. This is so important, and I can't emphasize how important this is. Practicing has so many benefits, and you should practice as many times as you need until you can comfortably do your talk. When we're nervous, we tend to speak a little bit faster, so practicing will also help with pacing. And in the real thing, we don't want to speak too fast or too slow. For the 3MT, there's a time limit, so practicing multiple times can help us stay within a specific time frame. I also suggest practicing in front of the mirror or recording yourself. No one likes to hear their own voice in the recording, I know, but this is super helpful to see if there are certain parts that tend to make you stutter or if there are parts that you just tend to forget. And just because it reads well on paper doesn't mean it sounds good when spoken. If you know where you're going to present, and if you can, I highly recommend going to the actual place to have a feel. I knew I was going to present in one of the auditoriums at my research institute, so the day before the actual competition, I went there, stood there at the front to have a feel of what it would be like for the next day. I also gave my talk a few times and pretended I was actually doing the presentation. Familiarizing yourself with the environment can calm your nerves for the actual event. And by practicing, you'll also feel well prepared, and naturally, you will know your material much better, and it also helps with overcoming the fear of public speaking. This will allow you to focus on connecting with the audience rather than worrying about what you're going to say next. The next tip ties into practicing, which is body language. Standing tall, being open, and using appropriate hand gestures shows confidence. Remember, you are the expert here, and you're sharing your knowledge with everyone. So please act like it. If you're comfortable with eye contact, look across the audience as you're speaking. This makes the listener feel engaged, and it also shows confidence. But if you're more anxiety prone, that is totally okay. We all feel a bit nervous on stage. I personally find it really helpful to look at the person's forehead or the pole or the wall or the poster behind them. It will still look like you're making eye contact, but it's less scary. Relating to body language is personality and tone. 55% of meaning in our words is derived from facial expressions, 38% of meaning is from how the words are said, and only 7% of meaning is from the actual words spoken. This means that it's not just about the words we say, it's how we say it. When you show you care, your audience will too. And if you show that you don't care, they won't either. There are two different facial expressions and tones with the exact same speech. And again, I want you to see which one is more impactful. Number 1. On average, 37 cases of invasive cancer are diagnosed every day in women. 2. On average, 37 cases of invasive cancer are diagnosed every day in women. Which is more impactful to you? The next tip is to dress for success. Dressing well can give you a big confidence boost. And of course, I'm not saying you need to wear anything fancy or expensive, but wear an outfit that you will feel good and look good in. But make sure your clothing is comfortable and allows movement during your presentation. Next tip is to visualize the outcome you want. I know when we get anxious, we tend to imagine the worst possible outcomes, especially with presenting. I want to challenge that behavior today, and I'd like you to envision yourself speaking on stage clearly, confidently, in front of a large audience. I personally use this tip a lot. And the night before my 3MT presentation, I went onto Pinterest and searched public speaking photography. A bunch of images showed up with a person speaking in front of a large crowd. And I imagined myself being that person and being in that situation. When I was looking at these images and picturing myself presenting in front of a large audience, I mentally practiced maintaining eye contact, using body language, and speaking loudly and clearly. And I felt the feelings that come with presenting. even though I was just visualizing it. I felt a little bit nervous, but I also imagined myself being in control, feeling empowered, and feeling excited. Positive thinking and visualization are super empowering, and it can help reframe your mindset and mentally prepare you for success. And finally, be your authentic self and stop comparing yourself to others. If you're a funny person, you're more than welcome to share a joke or create some humor. But if that is not you, don't force it. People connect with authenticity. And remember that your audience is always rooting for you. And that brings us to the end of the video. I hope this gave you some valuable insight on creating an impactful presentation and ways to deliver with confidence. Let me know what tip you found the most helpful and if there are any more that you would like to add. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you. Bye bye.